Hi, my name's Ewan McGahey, and in Enterprise Law today we are doing the regulation of rail transport. So I'd like to begin with this quote from Eugene Debs, who was a trade union leader in America in the late 19th century. Later went on to run for president as a socialist, but got locked in prison for his protests against the First World War and had to run as for president from prison. So he said that I believe that if people owned and operated the railroads in the interests of people instead of for private gain and profit, that the service would be greatly improved, the condition of men infinitely better, and another strike would never come. Now, if we fast forward today, when we look around the world, Eugene Debs has pretty much got his wish in most countries except for his home country of the United States. Public ownership of railways has become the worldwide norm. However, the governance of railways and the performance of railways in different countries varies greatly, as does service, the speed of the railways, and the degree to which they are electrified and therefore invested enough in and modernised. So key questions that we want to look at today are how can high-speed rail services best be financed? What is the best mode of financing, including the question of ownership, who owns it? Second, which stakeholders are best placed to govern railways? Whatever ownership model you have, whether public or private, how is governance best formulated to achieve the best services for people who rely on them, and what are the enforceable rights that passengers should have in the management of the railways. So we'll go through the history of railways, look at human rights and market failures relating to the sector, look secondly at how railways are financed, including the sort of three main parts: rail tracks, the operators of the train companies, and the carriages. So these are split up in Britain. They don't necessarily have to be, but whether they're split up functionally or not, in every country you have tracks, operators, and the carriages. So it makes sense to look at these discretely. Thirdly, the governance of railways. Fourthly, the rights of passengers, such as they are to get free service or affordable service and services of a good quality. Now, if we look at the technology in this field, we can see, and extending a bit to the history of transport, that the way that we got long distances fast throughout history has changed immensely. So people used to go long distances by horse or camel, depending on where you are in the world. But then, of course, in the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine was invented. And when the steam engine was invented, it wasn't long before somebody put wheels on it. And so we got the first steam-powered locomotives. Over the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, you had a transition from railways being coal-powered to the production of diesel engines. And today, although it's been like that for quite a number of decades, we've got the spread of electrified trains. So that's really important, of course, to tackle the climate crisis. So big technology changes in railways. And of course, as we've seen before, once we've got technological shifts, there is a basic right to the benefits of science universally in international law. Now, to go in a bit more detail in the history of railway regulation, really we can begin the story in 1775 with the invention by James Watt of the steam engine. In 1814, Stephenson used the steam engines for railways to bring coal out of a coal mine. The first passenger service was in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, followed shortly by the Liverpool to Manchester Railway in 1830. So, really the invention of railway was intimately tied to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And I should add that James Watt invented the steam engine in the first place because he was thinking about a way in which you could lift coal out of the ground more efficiently. So you have machines to lift the coal. Coal powers the machines. And as I say, it wasn't long before Stephenson put wheels on steam engine, and therefore you had a locomotive. Now, at the beginning of the railway system, you had a proliferation of private acts of parliament to build railways, usually getting compulsory purchase of land in order to build from Parliament or people in Parliament, and it was pretty nepotistic. You had to know somebody who knew somebody who could give you a favour, a private act of Parliament. And it wasn't until 1844 that the system began to be rationalised in a sort of comprehensive way. So there were lots of railways spreading around already by 1844, but the Railway Regulation Act of 1844 said that or created the first Act of Parliament for a unified way to regulate railways. It said no instance of public benefit from direct competition between railway lines had been observed at the time, and in 25 years, Parliament said that private operators of railways could be bought out by the public sector. So, from the beginning of railway regulation, it was seen that at least the shadow of public ownership was a good thing to make sure that the private operators behaved, although they very much did not. It also set a standard price of 1 penny per mile. In London, the first underground railway, the Tube, started operating in 1863. That was the old Paddington to Farringdon line, which of course is still there, moving slowly along. I think it's the Hammersmith and City line. And the Railway Franchises Act of 1871 in section 17 again explicitly stated that in an emergency government could take control, and this was after the 25-year period expired. The government didn't exercise its option to buy up the railways, but it still felt that it was necessary to have emergency control powers if necessary. So railways were left in the private sector, and a lot of people could see the problems with this. So Sir Tyler said in 1872 that the question was whether these big corporations that were running the railways would dominate the state or vice versa, or as he put it, whether the state should manage the railways or whether the railways should manage the state. And that's exactly the same sentiment that was seen in America, represented by Eugene Debs. Because if you had really powerful big corporations running an essential piece of infrastructure like the owners of the railways had, then it was seen that the money that they had, the capital that they could accumulate, was a threat to representative government. In 1873, the Railway Commission was set up, and it regulated rates that were charged for the railways. The Railways Act of 1921 merged the railway companies into 4 big entities, some of which are still with us today. So, for instance, Great Western is now Great Western, or at least the branding is still Great Western Railways. It established a Railway Rates Tribunal. And this was really the system that persisted until the beginning of the post-war period, or after World War II. Now, meanwhile, in London, you had a kind of separate story. Herbert Morrison was the leader of the London County Council, so the predecessor of the London Mayor. And he was a strong advocate for public ownership, being a Labour Party politician. But he also was pretty adamant that workers and service users should not play a part in how railways were governed if railways were brought into public ownership. Same thing with the buses. He put all that in a book called Socialisation and Transport in 1933. Big advocate of public ownership, but not for stakeholder governance. And that is pretty much what was seen, public ownership but no stakeholder involvement, from the London Passenger Transport Act of 1933. And now, as I say, after the Second World War, railways were brought into public ownership through the Transport Act of 1947. This was a big shift. You had the creation of a unified British Rail. It was managed but by a body from 1962 known as the British Railways Board. But almost tragically, in that period when rail did come into public ownership, you had a massive boom of cars. So roads, of course, could be built very cheaply at public expense, as they all were. Roads are indeed a public service, publicly funded, but cars privately produced, unless they were made by a nationalised car company, were getting cheaper and cheaper. And with the explosion of the usage of cars, people driving cars, railways became comparatively less used. And that led to the infamous Beeching Report and what's known as the Beeching Acts, where from 1963, a huge number of railways were discontinued in use because it was thought that they weren't going to be the future. Now, railways weren't privatised in the big privatisation wave under Margaret Thatcher from 1979 until her demise in, when was it, 1991. She said, Thatcher, that rail privatisation would be a privatisation too far, but that didn't stop her predecessor in the Conservative Party under John Major, which enacted the Railways Act of 1993, doing that very privatisation too far. Section 25 explicitly saying, as well as all the railways being sold off, that public bodies could not own the railways if it was a British public body. More about that, of course, shortly. Rail privatisation is nothing, or was nothing less than a disaster. It just depends on how you want to look at it, from what perspective, whether it's financial or social or cultural, but also from a safety perspective. So one of the first ways in which privatisation was undone, indeed within a decade, was after two terrible crashes in Hatfield and Potters Bar. The privatised track-owning entity called Railtrack plc was responsible for the signalling failures that led to crashes, with many people dying, dozens of people being injured. And so Network Rail, a government publicly owned entity, took over from Railtrack in 2002. However, the train operating companies remained privatised even after the Railtrack disaster until a couple of years ago with the Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Act of 2024. And this year we are getting, if a bill goes through Parliament, as I expect it will, a new entity called Great British Railways. It'll be a publicly owned company, and that should take effect sometime in 2026. Okay, so railways are really important, but we can see the shifts in fortunes of railways compared to other forms of transport, and in particular cars, in this chart here. So this shows UK passenger transport modes from 1952 up until 2017. Railways are in the maroon, on the maroon line, and you can see in the yellow line you've got cars, vans, and taxis, and on the y-axis you see that it's billions of passenger kilometres. So very simply, from about the mid-50s, roads were soaring in popularity, or car usage was soaring in popularity far beyond passenger journeys for trains, and that of course explains why roads are so congested. I suppose I should add that there are various things that you can do with a car that you can't do so easily with railways, and of course we all know it from our daily experience, but railways take you from one hub, namely the train station, to another hub, and then you've got to have another form of transport, whether it's bicycle or car, to get from that station to another place. Whereas with a car, you can drive directly from point to point. You don't need essentially two or perhaps three forms of transport on the journey. And that's one of the reasons why cars have a comparative advantage over rail. On the other hand, rail is faster than car journeys. Trains can go much quicker than cars, not least because there are speed limits on the motorways. in the UK. And trains are currently much cleaner environmentally, because basically you have more people on them, and also most passenger journeys on railways are electrified. Whereas cars are predominantly not electrified yet. Of course, that is another topic, and car electrification is set to move very fast, or already is moving quite fast. You can see at the end of this chart, from about 2003 onwards, that rail journeys start going up quite considerably. So the railways are being used to a much greater part of their capacity. But we've got to see this in the context of the beaching axe, which is in the next slide. It would be helpful if passenger journeys were continuing to have more places that were being served by trains. But after 1963, as this chart shows, which is just all the train lines around Britain, a huge number of train services were removed. And now what we're doing is looking at how we can rebuild very slowly some of those lines. If they've just been grown over, then they can be restored. There is discussion about revitalising what's known as the Varsity line that goes from Oxford to Cambridge, and I think it goes via Milton Keynes. Very important for reviving regional economies. But that was one of the tragedies of the late 20th century, the axing of railways. And this pattern is repeated in country after country. Trams ripped up, train lines ripped up all over the world to make way for the car. And that's something that is slowly being reversed in countries which are capable of doing it. Okay, so which human rights are at stake when it comes to railways? Don't often think of railways and human rights together, but as I mentioned earlier, one of the key human rights is that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. So when we're rolling out clean train technology, this right is key, because it suggests that government has a positive obligation. We can't just rely on the market to do it. And indeed, where trains are publicly owned, it's incumbent on the government to share the benefits of scientific advancement as best it can. That's Article 27 of the Universal Declaration, or Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Then we've got the right to life, which of course is relevant for decarbonising trains in Article 3 of the Universal Declaration, Articles 2 and 8 of the European Convention, and ICCPR in Article 6.1. And then in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, 2000, we see two other rights which are mainly of interest, but of course not binding in the UK. Article 36 says that the European Union recognises and respects access to services of general economic interest as in national law, and a train is a service of general economic interest. And Article 37 says that member states should aim for improvement of the quality of the environment, has to be integrated into the policies of the Union. So human rights are a bit more tangential, but nevertheless, we see, first of all, that trains are a service of general economic interest. And secondly, we have this right to the benefits of science, and rolling out clean technology is definitely important for protecting the right to life, to stop catastrophic climate damage. When we look at the Sustainable Development Goals for the world, Goal 9 and 11 are the most relevant. So Goal 9 says that nation states should build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, fostering innovation. And the targets under Goal 9 include quality, reliable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. So no right to free travel there, but there should be sustainable, affordable access. Second target is sustainable industrialization and to double the share of GDP in the least developed countries. And of course, one of the main ways that you can quickly boost economic growth is you build infrastructure. So that includes trains, it includes roads, it includes the electric grid, building that out, communication infrastructure. All of these things help people to do business. And fourth, upgrade infrastructure and retrofit industries to make them sustainable, clean technologies. Then there's goal 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. Target number 2 under goal 11 is to have safe, affordable, accessible and sustainable transport systems for all, improve road safety and especially expand public transport. But it's worth noting that the UN says in 2022 only 51.6% of the world's population had access to public transport. And of course, that is really important. We're not going to solve the climate crisis simply by changing all the fossil fuel cars and delivery vans and trucks and taxis and buses into electric ones. What we also want to do is increase public transport and so that people can have more efficient means of transport. And that overall leads to less production, which is currently still dependent on fossil fuels, much more energy efficient if we have more public transport. So what market failures are there when it comes to railways? I think there's 3 main ones. First of all, natural monopolies are abound when we look at transport. So rail tracks and train operating companies are both classic examples of natural monopolies. The railway tracks don't need to be built multiple times on the way from, say, London to Edinburgh. You just need one track. There doesn't need to be competing operators. In other words, it's cheaper for one firm to do the whole network. Train operating companies too are in a position of a natural monopoly because of the timetabling function. So it makes sense to have coordination of timetables. Yes, of course, you can have different train companies on single lines, but the timetabling function is a natural monopoly, and that speaks to the idea that basically you don't really need to have too many train operating companies. Now that said, it doesn't mean that you can't have open access, but the industry itself is inherently prone to monopoly, tends towards monopoly, much more efficient if you have one service provider. Then you've got unequal bargaining power between and information asymmetries between passengers and the train companies. Long history in consumer protection, very evident that if you're a passenger, you don't have any bargaining power really with the train company. They just give you take it or leave it terms. And thirdly, we've got externalities. So trains still today, especially when they're running on diesel, pollute. And when they don't pay for pollution, the train companies, to externalise the costs of production onto others. And so for all these reasons, we see very often around the world that trains are in public ownership. They go badly when they're not in public ownership, and we always have public regulation. We do not leave it to the market, private ownership and competition. Okay, so how are train companies, how is the train industry financed? First, we'll look a little bit more at the issue of network monopoly. Second, we'll look at state aid. And thirdly, we'll look at how train companies are still financed by not paying for pollution. This gives us a structure or a general overview of how train companies are financed, or where the money flows. So first of all, in Britain, you've got the Department for Transport, and if we were looking at roads, we would see that the Department of Transport finances roads, which are necessary for buses, cabs, delivery vehicles and cars to run on. Most of these are made by private automakers or private manufacturers, and they compete, the roads, these traffic compete with the railways to some degree. When we look at the trains, the Department of Transport also funds in fact, even more. So it gives money to Network Rail. It has funding for Network Rail, which runs the tracks. And Network Rail is necessary for the train operating companies to run on. As we're going to see, there's a lot of train operating companies and they're slowly being phased back into public ownership as a result of the 2024 Act. So you've still got the same branding, LNER, Great Western Railways, Greater Anglia. But when the Railways Bill passes sometime in 2026, it's probably going to be the case that some of these, perhaps all of them, are going to transition to a new brand, which will be Great British Railways. Although probably likely that there'll be retention of some regional identity. So that's almost certainly going to be the case for Scottish Rail and Transport for Wales. And in London, there'll still be the London Underground. The third part of the system is the rolling stock companies. So these are not in public hands, and they're not currently announced to be brought back into public hands, although that's definitely a possibility under the new railways legislation. So you've got the railway tracks, you've got the operating companies, and then you've got other companies, we'll see who they are in a second, who own the physical carriages that you ride in, usually under leasing agreements. And of course, they are being funded by the public indirectly through the Department of Transport to Network Rail to the train operating companies. And they're also being funded by passenger fares to the extent that passengers do pay for the trains. Also useful to look at this chart just briefly. This gives you a sense of how much transport contributes to greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. So what we can see in the dark blue line at the top, which is falling, is that the energy supply in the UK has decarbonised pretty rapidly since the 2000s, and that's basically as we shut down coal stations and we have more renewable energy. But the yellow line shows emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from transport. And as we've seen above, the vast majority of this is roads, but it has stayed stubbornly constant. And pretty much the same is true for trains, even though it's a relatively small share of greenhouse gas emissions from transport overall. So now let's look at the issue of network monopoly. So first thing is that railway tracks and operators can take natural monopoly profits, which if they do so, takes money out of the system. It goes to shareholders, doesn't get reinvested, and that restricts the amount of money going in to ensure that there are good trains. There is no incentive for a train operator or a rail track owner to limit their profits. They will do it to the very maximum they can, and that maximum is often set or was set in the UK by a regulator, but all is changing now that they're being brought back into public ownership. 1% of the UK's tracks actually have competing operators, even though the theory behind privatisation was that you get better outcomes if you privatise and then there would be some form of competition. Never really worked. The key piece of legislation that did that was the Railways Act 1993. Section 25 banned public ownership of railways, and specifically there was a ban on the UK government or any local authorities or other regional governments owning British Rail. And that was the case until it was changed by the Passenger Services Railways Public Ownership Act of 2024. So that's changed now, and now there can be public ownership of railways. And that act also says that the franchises expire, and as the franchises expire, the train operating companies will be brought back into public ownership. Then we've got the tracks. So as I mentioned before, railway tracks were privatised under a company called Railtrack, which is a public limited company, shares sold off to the public after the Railways Act 1993. But then it was transferred back into public ownership in 2002 under a new company called Network Rail Limited, 100% owned by the Secretary of State for Transport. And this happened after two really serious crashes, one in 2000 at Hatfield, not far from London. 4 people were killed, 70 people were injured, so it was really appalling. And then in 2001, the very next year, again, very similar causes led to the Potter's Bar crash. 7 people died, 76 people were injured. So that was the trigger for rail track to be put back into public ownership. But the train operating companies stayed in private ownership. It's just that private owners could include governments from other places in the world, so long as it wasn't British governments. So this sort of neatly illustrates the madness of the system, because the idea from the Conservative government back then was that the public sector is really inefficient, so it can't run the railways properly. Yet there were lots of efficient government-owned companies like Deutsche Bahn, SNCF from France, or Nederlandse Spoorwagen, which public entities, and they owned British railways. So pretty much every government around the world could own our railways except our own. Some of this madness began to be rolled back with the Scotland Act 2016. Section 57 explicitly enabled Scottish Rail to be taken into public ownership. And then there was always London, which was different. The Greater London Authority Act, Section 41, gives the London Mayor duties for transport. However, under the Blair government, it was mandated that the tube was put out to the private sector through what were called public-private partnerships. So railway fares and timetables would still be set by the Mayor of London. However, they would be contracted out to the private sector through public-private partnerships under sections 210 to 230 of the Greater London Authority Act. The former mayor, Ken Livingstone, tried to challenge this in a case called the Crown and Transport for London in 2001, but he lost, and we've still got public-private partnerships running the tube, and that's why you see, for instance, on the Bakerloo line, incredibly old carriages, loud screeching, very, very loud screeching when the tracks run, particularly around Elephant and Castle, and just a lack of investment. Train operating companies paid out enormous dividends to their shareholders, even while the service was terrible and you had big problems with fares going up, delays, and so forth. So since privatisation, about £3 billion was paid out to private shareholders, and that's all set out in the charts here. But even worse than that, you have just 3 rolling stock companies, which the private operating companies subcontracted to provide them with carriages. I mean, why on earth would you subcontract the ownership of carriages out to more private companies? Well, it really only makes sense if you've got a privatised system where you have changing in who the train operating companies are. So if one train operating company loses its license and it's got lots of carriages, instead of trying to sell that to the next one, it's better to have a rolling stock company that just owns and leases the carriages to whichever train operating company there is under the licenses that are given out by the Secretary of State. And that led to an incredibly concentrated quote-unquote market. There are 3 main rolling stock companies, and they're still there, called Angel Trains, Eversholt and Peterbrook. And since privatisation, they have taken about £4.5 billion in dividends since the privatisation of the railways. So incredibly lucrative. However, despite these enormous profits being paid out to the train operating companies and to the rolling stock companies, you also have an enormous amount of state aid that flowed in from government. So that's the next way in which the train system really was financed. So from 2009 to 2019, about £3.8 billion was earned when the Secretary of State licensed out franchises to the train operating companies. So train operating companies bid to run the line, for instance, from London to Edinburgh, and they have to pay a fee in order to win that bid. And in total, it looks pretty good. £3.8 billion was earned in rail franchises. However, in 2018 to 2019 alone, 7.1 billion was paid by the government in subsidies, while the companies were paying out dividends to their shareholders. And you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that the public is still footing most of the bill for private companies to pay money out to their shareholders. From April 2020 to 2023, as COVID-19 hit, it got even worse. So £23 billion was paid in subsidies to train companies for lost ticket sales in order to keep the train operating companies from not going insolvent. And then you also have tacit subsidies given by the government-owned Network Rail, leasing out tracks cheaply to train operating companies, which adds on to the subsidy bill. So it was calculated by some journalists in the Financial Times in an article called "What's Next for Britain's Broken Railways" in 2024, that the rail system from 2020 to 2023 cost a whopping £52 billion to subsidise. And even before COVID, the subsidies were huge. So the bar chart at the bottom of this slide shows the importance of fares to the rail industry. But what we can see is that it's just over half the amount of money going to the rail industry that is from fares. It's government subsidies paying quite a lot of it. We can see this over a period of time. Of course, COVID was exceptional, but there were lots and lots of subsidies before that from government directly to train operators. This goes from about 2000 till 2024. But when we add in the other sort of real subsidies, namely from Network Rail giving out cheap track to the train operating companies, you get billions and billions and billions being effectively paid to train operating companies to run the railway system. And so very simply, if the government, the public sector, the taxpayer is paying that much money for the railways, why on earth have it in private ownership at all? Just doesn't make sense. And that is, of course, what Parliament finally acted upon in 2024. Now, if we look at the European context more widely, this regulation doesn't apply to the UK now, but the EU has a programme to ensure that there is a trans-European transport network that covers the whole continent. Article 1 aims to set out corridors for train travel, as well as other forms of transport, roads, air, and shipping. And in the annexes, there are lots of lovely maps all over Europe in great detail showing what the priority areas are. The goal is to improve road, rail, inland waterways and air lines so that all the transport networks are fully integrated with one another. Article 6 says that member states should complete a core network in 2030, complete an extended network by 2040 and a comprehensive network by 2050. And so the conditions for what's in the network includes, in Article 16, a minimum rail speed for passenger services of 160 kilometres per hour in core and extended parts of the network. When we're looking at roads, roads in the core network should have at least dual carriageways. Article 34 says that major airports with over 12 million passengers a year have to be connected to long distance rail. Article 41 says that cities within the network have to have urban mobility plans for zero or low transport emission. And Article 48 requires there's an overlap between this strategy and military mobility requirements, all approved by the Council of the EU in 2023. Next way in which the railway system is financed is by not paying for pollution. So in the UK, about 38% of railway tracks are electrified. And a rough estimate is that it would probably cost, given how much has already been spent, about £9 billion to electrify the rest. It's not all bad news because when you look at the number of passenger journeys, it's actually the busiest parts of the network that are already electrified. So it's well over 70% of passenger rail journeys are on electrified lines. But the UK is considerably behind where it could be. There could be a good technological solution because, of course, it requires a lot of construction to run electric cables overhead, change the tracks. But Great Western Railways in 2025 did its first test of a big battery train, which it says can go just over 200 miles, and it can run at a top speed of around 60 miles per hour, although in the test that went for 200 miles it was going at 45 miles per hour. So an easy way to get rid of all the polluting diesel trains that still exist on what would that be? 62% of the railway lines around Europe is to simply replace the rolling stock transfer from diesel trains to battery electric trains. Under the Renewable Energy Directive from the European Union 2018, Article 1 says that there is a target for 2030 of 42.5% of all final energy consumption in heating, electricity and transport being renewable. So that includes similar target there for the UK, or that's at least the very minimum what we should be aspiring to. And under Article 25, at least 14% of renewables have to be in the final energy consumption for transport. But the UK is going pretty slow and progress doesn't look like it's going to change around explicitly yet in current Acts of Parliament. But there's no reason why the Secretary of State and Great British Railways and train operating companies could not go much faster. And I'll show you some examples of exactly why that's true in just a minute. When we look at railway fares and electrification, there is not much that has to be increased in fares, if anything, when trains are electrified. So this chart shows the percentage of electrification in different countries around the OECD. So electrification percentage is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis there is the cost of a typical fare for an 80-kilometre trip in euros. This data is from 2023 from some journalists at Euronews. So it's not a comprehensive data set, but this gives us a pretty good guide of where different countries stand. And very simply, you can see that more electrification is correlated with slightly higher fares, but not much. And what we can also see is that countries that have privatised systems are not doing particularly well. So the UK has publicly owned tracks and privately owned train operating companies until very recently. Much higher fares for a typical journey, doesn't seem to be doing particularly well at electrification. The United States, funnily enough, has things the other way around. So you have a publicly owned operator called Amtrak for passenger journeys, but the railway tracks and the underlying infrastructure is privately owned, and it's doing abysmally. So it has almost no electrified lines and almost no very scant service. And its train fares are still pretty high compared to other countries. Around the EU, the average is better than Britain for electrification, so 57.6% for European Union railways. And this map also shows the railway lines in the red and particularly the purple that are high speed or pretty fast. This map shows the priority areas in the TENT regulation for the core network, where member states have to focus on upgrades and connections to make the trains faster. But when we look at other places around the world, notably China, Europe is kind of put to shame. So China's railways have been electrified to over 75% now. And you can see in the red lines the pace of high-speed railway rollout is pretty phenomenal. So China's got an excellent high-speed rail network that is spreading around almost all major population centres in China, and no doubt is going to keep going. India is the biggest success story for railway electrification. It has now reached just about 100% railway electrification around the subcontinent, which is an incredible achievement through a commission on railway electrification. India is not doing so well at high-speed railway rollout. However, the plan that you can see, and the Indian railways, of course, are enormous. Next to the National Health Service in Britain, one of the biggest employers on the planet. But in the map on the right, you can see that there are plans for rolling out at least a skeleton of a high-speed railway network to the major cities, Delhi, down to Mumbai, Mumbai over to Calcutta, and down to Hyderabad and Chennai in the south. Then we look at the United States and poor old America. Everything is going pretty badly there. So only 0.84% of railways are electrified in the United States. Maybe that could change with battery electric technology, because there just doesn't seem to be any impetus to electrify lines. But there is also no real plan, no real strategy, and it doesn't look like anything's going to change for high-speed rail rollout. This is a map which shows what could be, but it's not from the federal government. It's from an enthusiast group called the US High-Speed Rail Association. Of course, everything would be possible, but the federal government just simply hasn't been functioning properly in order to do anything useful that American voters might want for a few decades now. Then we get to the topic of the governance of the railways. So there's 4 topics to discuss under this. First of all, the regulator, which is known as the Office for Rail and Road. Secondly, Network Rail. Thirdly, the train operating companies, which are probably going to be transferring to a new entity called Great British Railways. And fourthly, what happens when train companies go insolvent. So the special administration procedure for railways. Before we go into those 4 areas, it makes sense to look at some of the theory on how trains and the railways, and I suppose we could expand that to the rest of transport, the rest of the public sector. How should these things be governed ideally? And there are a lot of debates around the early to mid 20th century on this issue. One of the leading figures was an influential minister in the post-war Labour government called Herbert Morrison, who I mentioned before was leader of the London County Council in the 1930s. So he wrote a book called Socialisation and Transport. And in chapter 11, he argued that you shouldn't give passengers or workers any voice in how train companies or bus companies were managed, even if they were brought into the public sector. He thought that the public sector should be run by the ministers who are accountable through the London County Council or through Parliament to the public, but there should be no stakeholder involvement for more direct representation within a service. And so his reasoning for excluding stakeholder voice was that he said, if passengers had a voice on a transport board that was running buses or trains, the board of directors, by having passenger representation, would find it hard to resist various employers' organisations' claim for representation as well. And if workers were allowed to have representation on the boards of directors, to be able to vote for who was on the board of directors, said Morrison, it would be difficult to resist a similar claim from the users of transport. So in other words, you shouldn't have worker representation in a transport company because then you'd have to have passenger representation. And if you had passenger representation, ostensibly, it would be hard to resist representation for different employers' organisations. But none of this, and so therefore his conclusion seemed to be that you shouldn't have representation for anyone at all. What you should do, said Morrison, is you should have experts appointed to the board of the directors by the relevant minister. In other words, somebody like the author of this book, Herbert Morrison. And he says that hopefully the company would have a social conscience, a corporate spirit, and a public purpose to ensure that rights of consumers and labour are safeguarded, but you have no representation for workers or passengers to safeguard their own interests themselves. So this is the top-down system of governance that was became the standard norm through the post-war years in Britain. And I think it's really one of the major reasons why British Rail was so unloved. So before privatisation, the one thing that privatisation was worse than was British Rail, but British Rail wasn't too good and wasn't that much liked before. And one of the main reasons for that was the lack of representation for the staff, who were really the experts that could tell you how a good, efficient system would run, working on it every day, and the passengers who use the system as well. Now, Herbert Morrison was definitely not the only voice, and his theory was definitely not the only theory of how you should have governance of public services. A Labour Party document called For Socialism and Peace in 1934 certainly favoured employee representation. It said that they should have an effective share in the control and direction of industry. And another very influential minister called Nye Bevan wrote in a book in 1952 and advocated through this for his whole career, in a book called In Place of Fear, that there should be worker representation on boards of companies, particularly public companies. And as you'll remember, Nye Bevan was the hero who created the National Health Service, the first Minister for Health with the new publicly owned service. So in Place of Fear, he wrote, the conversion of an industry to public ownership is only the first step towards socialism. The individual citizen will still feel that society is on top of him until he is enfranchised in the workshop as well as at the ballot box. And the crack of the overseer's whip, however disguised in its modern form, is not how socialists see the future of industrial relations. So you should have worker representation in boards of directors because, he said, at the heart of it, democracy in politics is protected by extending its boundaries. In other words, having more economic democracy to match political democracy. Now, when we look around the world, we see in lots of publicly owned services where competition doesn't work, where markets fail, when consumers can't effectively vote with their feet anymore, service users also, next to workers, have representation in public services. So most wealthy countries in the OECD have worker representation on boards of all large companies, but also when we look at public services, publicly owned companies, there's some voice for service users too, although the patterns vary greatly. But what we've got in Britain, public ownership in the railways again being very new or relatively recent, still being rolled out, we've still got this mentality that we should have top-down governance by Whitehall. And that is pretty much what we see through the Officers Rail and Road, Network Rail and Great British Railways at the moment, although who knows, with the right arguments being made, it could change. So first piece in the governance picture is the Office for Rail and Road. It is established by the Railways and Transport Safety Act of 2003. Schedule 1 says the Office of Rail and Road has a chair, which is appointed by the Secretary of State, and it also has 4 members, which are also appointed by the Secretary of State. They have terms of 5 years, and they can be dismissed, but only for a good reason. The Railways Act 1993, Section 4, sets out what the duties are of the Office of Rail and Road. And this has been amended a number of times. So Section 4.1 ZB says it has a duty for improving railway service performance and to promote the use of the railway network. BB says that it should aim for sustainable development, efficiency and economy, competition, interconnection of the services, and that companies should be able to plan the future of their businesses with a reasonable degree of insurance. Section 45B says that it has safety functions which should follow guidance of the Secretary of State, and Section 67 says that the Office of Rail and Road has a competition function alongside the Competition and Markets Authority. But as we've mentioned, only 1% of tracks are in fact open to competing railways, so this is really subsidiary, and that's seen more in the new legislation setting up Great British Railways. So you have a regulator which I think is an indication that even when the railways were privatised, it was never trusted that competition and private ownership would function by themselves. You have to have a regulator to set prices, set standards, and that's exactly what happened. Then we've got Network Rail, which owns the tracks. So Railtrack was separated from the rest of the operating companies in 1994. It was turned into a publicly limited company, and it was sold off to shareholders in 1996. Things never went well for Railtrack. It asked the government for subsidies under the Tony Blair government, the Brown government. More subsidies were refused, and it was forced to go into insolvent administration, upon which it was transferred to the publicly owned Network Rail Limited. That is a public body. It was officially recognised as a public body in the 2014 statistics onwards, which meant that if it's got a debt, that appears on the books of the Treasury. It contributes to the national debt. And as a wholly owned subsidiary of the government, its directors are all appointed by the Secretary of State. So the Morrisonian model, well and truly alive, top-down control from Whitehall, no stakeholder representation yet. If we go to European Union member states now, I think it's useful to compare what was being done in the railway package, and of course this applied to the UK. The Single European Railway Directive of 2012 sets up a regulatory structure for all railways in the European Union, whether or not they were publicly or privately owned. Article 2 says that its scope includes all railways except for urban and regional railways. Article 3.1 says that it applies to railway undertakings whether public or private. And one of the big goals was to ensure that railways running between member states would be properly integrated in order to improve the cohesion of the internal market within the European Union. Article 4 said that railway companies had to separate or be separate from infrastructure managers, and their assets and budgets and accounts had to be separated from the member states. And the reason to separate the infrastructure from the operators and to have separate accounts is to ensure that market power cannot be projected from the owners, for instance, of tracks onto operating companies in order to abuse a dominant position. And separation of the accounts is necessary to foster transparency over what the flow of money is and whether there are any unjustified subsidies. But completely neutral about whether the railways and the component parts were publicly or privately owned. Article 5 said that railways should be managed, whether publicly or privately, by commercial principles at the lowest possible cost for the quality of service that is required. And Article 7 to 7F set out independence rules for different infrastructure managers. And I guess this is worth emphasising for, just because it's an important part of structural separation, which we'll also see. We saw it with electricity, we're going to see it with telecoms. But it's also important politically because around the Brexit poll, it was claimed by a number of people, including on the left of politics, who were more often in favour of European Union membership, but people who were against EU membership claimed that the EU somehow had mandated or pushed railways to be privatised. Absolute nonsense. There's nothing in EU law that says that railways have to be privatised. On the contrary, the European Union treaties says that EU law cannot prejudice member state systems of property ownership. So member states can privatise whatever they want. They can have everything in public ownership, be a quasi-communist member state if they wanted to be, with everything under public ownership. Nothing in the EU law is allowed to say different because of Article 345. There's also an EU agency for railways regulation since 2016. Now, if we go to the train operating companies in the UK, these are slowly being transferred to the public sector. So, as I mentioned before, under the Railways Act 1993, sections 4 and 23 and 25 put a ban on public railway owners. These contain the Office of Rail and Road Duties, and the system was that the Office of Rail and Road would oversee franchising to the private companies. By 2024, already 40% of the UK network, if we measure it by passenger miles, had been renationalised, effectively taken back into public ownership, and most contracts were due to end in the following Parliament. The Department for Transport in 2021 put out a paper on Great British Railways proposing the merger into 5 regional railway companies, new passenger service contracts to set timetables and fares, predict improvements when bidding for contracts. So a sort of new cohesive system really based on what was happening in London, but did not recommend public ownership, largely because it was still a Conservative government and they were ideologically wedded to privatisation still. But then the new Labour government was elected on a promise of public ownership of the railways, and that's what they passed, at least the first stage of it, in the Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Act 2024. So Section 1 bans any extension of franchises to private companies. Section 2 says there has to be future provision of service by the public. Section 3 enshrines a public sector equality duty. But there's no standards yet under the Act for what kind of governance train operating companies will have to follow. No provision for worker representation or union representation or passenger representation on boards of directors. There is something called a Passengers Council under the Railways Act of 2005, set up under sections 19 to 21. This goes by the brand name of Transport Focus, but it is or has had up till now very, very few meaningful powers, and it's not appointed by passengers. It's appointed by the Secretary of State. So not much focus on passengers, at least from a ballot box perspective, or still the top-down Whitehall control model from that we've inherited from Herbert Morrison. Now then there's the Railways Bill, which is very, very likely to become the Railways Act of 2026. And these are the main sections in the Act, although there's all still to be determined, but might change around a bit, probably not too much as it goes through the Commons and the Lords before getting royal assent. So Section 1 says the Secretary of State can designate a company as Great British Railways. And Great British Railways will have the functions of managing, operating, maintaining, renewing and improving railway infrastructure, providing passenger services, determining the fares, and selling tickets. So that sounds like Great British Railways is set to take over from train operating companies one by one as the franchises expire. It is a company that can be designated by the Secretary of State. Presumably the Secretary of State can set up any company and it can have any governance structure as it wants. The Act does not say anything about how Great British Railways will be governed. And that means that there's still a big open space that could be filled with stakeholder representation for workers, for passengers, if the government chooses. but nothing required yet in law. Section 6 says that Great British Railways will have a duty to cooperate with Transport for London, also the Greater London Authority Act. Section 175 will be amended to that effect. And Section 7 to 8 say that the Secretary of State will be able to give directions to Great British Railway to exercise its functions in the way that the Secretary of State wants. In Scotland, it will be the Scottish ministers instead who can give directions to Great British Railway for the operations up there. Section 11, together with Schedule 1, will introduce a new sections 7b and 8 in the Railways Act 1993, saying that the Secretary of State can grant a licence to Great British Railways as an operator, or it can grant licence to others if it chooses, so there can still be different operators, potentially from France through the Channel Tunnel to operate on British railway lines. And Section 8b says that the fees can be set for a licence in the way that the Secretary of State chooses, and any conditions that the Secretary of State sees fit may attach. It also says that in consultation with the Passengers Council, the licences can be modified by the Secretary of State. Sections 15 and 16 require the Secretary of State to set out a strategy to develop rail and provide services, including duty of the Great British Railways and the Office of Rail and Road to have a duty to pay regard to this strategy, and there will be an explicit target that has to be set by the Secretary of State to increase use of the railways for freight. Section 18, really important, sets out a list of duties of the Secretary of State, the Great British Railways and the Office of Rail and Road, all with a public focus, which is a welcome change to the privatised system that we had before. Subsection 2 says that they will have a duty to promote the interests of users, the service users, the passengers, to promote the use of the railway, a duty for high standards of railway service for business, to protect the public interest, and have efficient use of public funds. There is a safety duty explicitly, and there's also a competition duty, but this is subsidiary, for instance, to the safety duties, the rules on licensing. So, there's no duty to have competition above cooperation and a sound functioning of railways. But so the place that will really matter is, as I say, for instance, if you've got a private operator or a public operator going on a railway line at the same time as a public operator or coming from another country, for instance, through the Channel Tunnel, then there is duty to ensure that there is fair competition between the different operators. All this, however, must be seen next to the overriding duty to provide a good railway service in the interests of users. Great British Railways can set fares, but it must, under Section 34, have discounts for young, elderly or disabled people. It may have discounts for others, and there's nothing to stop it in law having zero fares if it decided that not having fares was more efficient. More about that in a bit. Section 36 says that the Passenger Council has duties to pay regard to the interests of disabled users and for the efficient use of funds. The Passengers Council will get new powers to investigate and get information. It will have new complaints powers and resolution powers. And in Section 46, potentially very important, it can set standards on access for disabled people, to give information to users, to pay compensation for disruption, and set the complaints process. But as I mentioned earlier, the Passengers Council is not passengers. It's still appointed by the Secretary of State with no right to vote for passengers. So these binding rights are not really for passengers yet, although that could change with an amendment to either the practice or the law on what the Secretary of State does or how the Secretary of State appoints the Passengers Council. Okay, and sections 59 to 63 says that the Great British Railways will have to publish a plan on the use of its capacity, a policy on the use of its infrastructure, and publicise the timetable that it sets. The timetable for transferring train operating companies into public ownership is what we see here. So, in fact, most of the railway sector is now well and truly in public ownership. Great Anglia's franchise expired in October 2026. You've got, for instance, South Western Railway expiring in May 2026, C2C July 2025. Beg your pardon, South Western Railways 2025, C2C 2025, and the other ones are coming soon. So the next one to pass into public ownership will be Thameslink and Southern, which will be good news for all of those passengers. Particularly Southern has been a railway that has seen an awful lot of delays and misery for people commuting from the south of England into London. Now, there is a different procedure for railway companies to be if they go insolvent, and this was really seen around Railtrack before, because the system of transferring railway companies into public ownership is probably not going to be used that much anymore, but we still have a special administration procedure and worth looking at because it's helpful when we look at other sectors like water or electricity. So Section 59 of the Railways Act 1993 says that there can be a rail administration order of a railway company if it's insolvent, and it will have the purpose, the railway administration order, to ensure that the relevant activities may be properly carried out pending a transfer of the entity. So that is a key norm which differs to what normally happens in administration, which is that the company is run in order to try and get returns for creditors. So the creditors, usually the ones with the floating charge, are in charge of appointing the administrator, and they run the company in order to get their debts paid off. But the key goal in special administration for railways is that railways continue to operate, that the relevant activities may be properly carried on pending a transfer. Section 60 sets out the grounds for the Secretary of State to petition for special administration, and these are either insolvency or if the company should be wound up on a just and equitable basis, usually in the public interest. Section 61 says there's a restriction on the petition to on having a petition to the Secretary of State or without the Secretary of State's consent. It cannot happen. Section 63 says that the government may make grants to achieve the purpose of an administration order. In other words, it can subsidise a company that's in distress. Schedule 6 and paragraph 5 says that secured creditors may get the best price reasonably available consistent with the purposes of the railway administration order. And again, that's an important shift from the standard rules, which is that secured creditors should usually get their market value or the market value of their claims. So what matters under the law for railways is that creditors get the best price available, but consistent with the purpose of the railway administration order. So if paying off debts would interfere with the smooth running of the railways, then the debts can be reduced or potentially not paid at all in a bad situation. When Railtrack went insolvent, there was a case called Railtrack plc in 2002, which held that the rail regulator could give Railtrack directions to enter an access contract while it was administration. So the regulator's powers persist. And another piece of litigation called Weir and the Secretary of State for Transport involved the aggrieved shareholders who said that the government had forced the company into administration and they were getting much less compensation than they should be due. They argued that it was a deprivation of their property rights Human rights under the European Convention, Protocol 1, Article 1, were being violated because the Secretary of State did not continue to subsidise Railtrack, and they argued that the Secretary of State was guilty of misfeasance. This was all rejected out of hand in the Weir case. Justice Lindsay holding that there was no misfeasance, no violation of human rights. And that, I think, gives you a very strong indication that usually the courts will defer to what the government is doing, unless the government is actually acting contrary to the law, making an error of law, acting irrationally. It's not going to be held, very likely not going to be held, there's any misfeasance in public office. And it's useful to emphasise that shareholders are not entitled to market value compensation. Bondholders are not entitled to market value compensation. Under the European Convention case law, shareholders and bondholders are entitled to a fair value. And so what the job of the government is to do is to strike a fair balance in the public interest. The actual costs of special administration for Railtrack, the administrative costs were not that high. Might seem high in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, it cost £70 million for the administration of Railtrack. Insolvency practitioners, now called EY or Ernst & Young, carried out the administration. But compared to the billions of pounds which are usually at stake in big insolvencies like this, it's a relatively low amount. The shareholders, by the way, did settle with the government after the Weir case, and they got some compensation, but it was very low. The special administration procedure was pretty low cost compared to the millions and millions which privatisation had cost. And we can see a graphic example of that in the Metronet case, which is about, I think it's the Bakerloo Central and Victoria Line, 2007 case. Which disclosed that just running the contracts or drafting the contracts and administering the contracts for those tube lines, all the lawyers, all the consultants, etc., cost £410 million. So the transfer of Railtrack into public ownership through the special administration procedure was pretty cheap by comparison. Okay, final topic is what specifically enforceable rights passengers have in the railways. So first thing is the rights that people have to access the railways and also potentially get free travel. There's no free train travel in the UK yet outside specific age groups. However, it doesn't have to be this way. There is free transport for railways, trams and buses in the whole of Luxembourg. And that has been the case since 2020. Now, okay, Luxembourg is quite small, but there's a growing number of places around the world where free travel, not yet so much in railways, but certainly for buses, for trams, is becoming seen more and more frequently. So there's free transport in Malta since 2022, in Tallinn since 2013, in Montpellier in France since 2023, both buses and trams. In Dunkirk, free buses, I believe, since 2018. In Kansas City, of all places, since 2019. And in New York City, buses are being made free under the new Zoran Mamdani mayoralty since his election at the end of 2025. And there's absolutely no reason why a future government couldn't decide that some or all train travel could be free as well. Of course, in order to have free train travel, you need to have trains in the first place. And we saw with the Beeching Acts that a lot of trains were closed down. And the Save Our Railways Director of Passenger Rail Franchising case in 1996 illustrates that the regulator was in charge of closure of rural services and they could be reduced. And the opposite trend should be taking place. That was one of the things that happened again with privatisation. More and more services were axed, but a future railway service that is publicly owned and efficiently run should reverse that trend. Now, There are categories, as I say, of free travel for some people. In London, the Greater London Authority Act 1999, sections 240 to 43, says that there is a freedom pass which gives pensioners free travel on the tube, trains, trams, buses if you are age 66 and over. Also free travel for disabled people. And Transport for London also has free bus and tram travel if you are under 18, and also free travel on the tube. If you are under 11, you have to be accompanied by an adult. If you're under 5, you get free travel without being accompanied by an adult. But although I'm sure if you're under 5, you should be accompanied by an adult. But there we are. Then there's, in absence of free travel, regulation of fares. So this has always been the case through privatisation as well. Section 28 of the Railways Act 1993 says that a rail franchise agreement may include provision with respect to fares to be charged for travel. Section 29(5) says, subject to any statutory requirements, that a franchise agreement may contain any such provisions as the franchising director thinks fit. So that would now be the Office of Rail and Road. So fares are capped, or they are set in franchise agreements. Under privatisation, fares have almost uniformly risen, but it also depends on who's in government. So the story in London is pretty illustrative. Essentially, when we had a Conservative mayor in London, you might remember a guy called Boris Johnson, fares went up quite a lot. When there have been Labour mayors in power in London, fares have stayed flat, they've been frozen, or they have come down. And we can see that in the chart at the bottom. Ken Livingstone, fares stayed stable. Johnson, they went up. With Sadiq Khan, fares have stayed much more stable. Finally, we have rights in relation to delays of trains. So the Rail Passenger Rights Regulation from 2021 under Article 19, and this persists despite Brexit in national legislation, says that if there's a 1 hour delay, passengers have the right to be refunded 25% of the ticket price. And for a 2 hour or more delay, there's a right to be refunded 50% or more of the ticket price. Under Article 20, there's a right to assistance to be kept informed and refreshments and meals for any delay that is over an hour if refreshments and meals can reasonably be supplied. And then, important for cyclists, under Article 6, there is a right to take a bike on a train if it is not too crowded. And Articles 10 and 11 give a right to information on tickets and reservations. So some specifically enforceable rights, not too many, beyond simply your rights in contract and consumer protection to get whatever service is given to you for the price of the ticket. So to wrap up, if we want to improve the railways still further and patch up some of the gaps in the law to get the railways in Britain up to European and the best international standards, I think there are 4 main areas of reform that we could look at. The first is to electrify the railways properly, have a consistent programme. The best model is by far and away what India has done with its railways. And because all the railways in India are now electrified, there are probably a lot of electrification experts in India who might be well placed to advise or work on electrifying the railways in Britain. Also, now given new battery technology, it should be a priority to replace diesel trains and all the pollution that they create in and around stations and across train lines with battery electric trains. They can go 200 miles and up to 60 miles per hour already, so there's no reason why, as rolling stock comes out of service, all new rolling stock should be not diesel and should be battery electric. And high-speed rail should be rolled out as quickly as it possibly can, consistent with biodiversity and environmental impacts not being too great. It would be a good idea to have all of these things in primary legislation rather than just leaving it up to whichever Secretary of State is in charge. Second point is that the Office of Rail and Road should probably itself have a duty explicitly to decarbonise transport. You could put this in section 4. Thirdly, it would be a good idea to democratise governance, as we see in the best models around the world, as Nye Bevan was calling for. A good starting point would be to require that at least 1/3 of all boards of directors is elected by the workforce who work on the trains, and there should be an element to represent passengers. It could be done through local government or regional government, but 1/6 would be a good starting point for who's on the board of Network Rail on Great British Railways and other companies that are running the railways. And fourth, I think to be efficient, it would be a priority to bring the rolling stock companies into public ownership, just like the train operating companies, as their franchise agreements or their contracts expire to supply rolling stock. The future rolling stock should not rely on private provision. Just doesn't make sense, especially if the train operating companies are publicly owned anyway. It could actually be done more cheaply in the long term if the Treasury would not bother about what it looks like for the national debt figures, which of course it still does, by buying out the rolling stock companies at a fair value instead of waiting to pay the market value with all the profits and all that, therefore the lost investment that means for the public sector by keeping the rolling stock companies in public ownership for the foreseeable future. So with those reforms, the railway service could operate a lot better and start to catch up with our international competitors.